The young woman moved through the grand room like a whisper. In a space filled with loud laughter and the sharp, clinking sounds of expensive glassware, she was a study in silence. Her simple black dress was a uniform of invisibility, a shadow against the glittering backdrop of silk gowns and crisp, dark suits. She carried a heavy silver tray, but the people she served never seemed to see the tray or the hands that held it steady. They only saw the fresh drink appearing at their elbow, as if by magic. To them, she wasn't a person with a name and a history. She was a function, a part of the elegant machinery of the evening. As unremarkable as the polished floor or the soft, ambient lighting, her feet ached, a dull, familiar throb that started in her heels and worked its way up her calves. She had been on them for hours, navigating the narrow spaces between tables with a practiced grace that she had learned over long, tiring nights. She learned to anticipate the sudden lean of a guest, the quick reach for a napkin, the absent-minded stretch of a leg. It was a dance and she was an expert, but it was a dance performed in the background, always just out of the spotlight. As she passed one table, a man in a tailored suit held up a single, commanding finger without even looking at her. She nodded, a small, unseen gesture, and made her way to the bar to retrieve another whiskey. He didn't say thank you when she placed it down. They rarely did. The air in the room was a thick cocktail of smells. There was the rich, sweet scent of women's perfume, a cloud of jasmine and rose that followed them like a halo. There was the faint, acrid smell of cigar smoke that drifted in from the enclosed terrace, a sign of old money and closed-door deals. And underneath it all was the smell of the hotel itself, the lemony wax used on the wood, the clean, sterile scent of the linen tablecloths, and the faint, metallic tang of the polishing liquid she used on the silver trays before her shift began. It was the smell of other people's lives, a world so different from her own small, quiet apartment that it felt like another planet. Her eyes, tired but observant, scanned the room not as a guest would, but as a worker does. She saw the details. The way a woman's diamond bracelet caught the light from the massive chandelier, sending little rainbows dancing across the ceiling. The small, almost invisible stain on a white tablecloth that she would have to discreetly address later. The way a young couple, dressed in clothes that looked too new and expensive for them, nervously clutched their menus, trying to fit in. She saw it all, but she was seen by none. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of their glamorous party, in the far corner of the lounge. Standing on a small, raised platform was the reason she sometimes felt a flicker of something other than exhaustion. It was a grand piano, black and gleaming under its own soft, focused spotlight. It looked like a sleeping beast, elegant and powerful. During the early part of the evening, a man with white hair and stiff fingers played pleasant, unobtrusive melodies. But now it was silent. The lid was closed and it stood there waiting. Sometimes, when she had a moment to spare, she would stand near the service station and just look at it. Her fingers would twitch at her sides, remembering the feel of keys, the weight of them, the way a chord could vibrate. Right up through your arms and into your heart, she remembered a different kind of ache in her fingers, the good kind of ache that came from practicing for hours, the calluses that had built up on her fingertips like tiny shields. It felt like a lifetime ago. That was before life had become a series of yes, sirs, and right away, ma'ams. Before the music she made was only in her head, a silent soundtrack to her long shifts. The piano in the corner was a reminder of that other life, a dream that had been packed away in a box along with her sheet music, tucked under the bed in her rented room. Looking at it was both a comfort and a pain, like touching a scar. A burst of loud, barking laughter pulled her back to the present. A table of men, their faces red from drink and good fortune, were slapping each other on the back. One of them was telling a story, his voice booming across the quiet hum of the room. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. It was the sound of success, the sound of men who owned the world, or at least a small, glittering piece of it. She moved past their table, a silent shadow refilling their water glasses, and they didn't even break their rhythm. Their eyes were on each other, their world closed and self-sufficient. She was just the help, A fleeting interruption that wasn't even noticed. She paused for a moment by a large potted fern, its leaves like giant green hands. She took a deep breath, the cool air a small relief. She watched the room, this strange, beautiful aquarium of wealthy people. They floated by, secure in their bubbles of conversation and privilege. She wondered what it would be like to be one of them. To sit at one of those tables and not worry about the price of the drink in front of you. To laugh that loudly, that freely. To not feel the constant low-grade hum of anxiety about rent, about bills, about the future. It wasn't that she envied their money, not really. It was their ease she longed for, the simple, unburdened way they moved through the world. Her shift continued. The trays grew heavier, her smile grew a little more strained, and the music in her head became a little fainter. She cleared empty plates, the remnants of a meal she could never afford. Their rich sauces and delicate seasonings, a stark contrast to the simple sandwich she would eat later in the staff break room. She wiped away a ring of condensation from a table, her movements efficient and invisible. She was a part of the scenery, the human equivalent of the wallpaper, blending into the background so the guests could shine as the night wore on. The crowd thinned slightly. Some tables emptied, only to be reset and filled again. The energy in the room shifted from loud and boisterous to a more intimate, subdued hum. The lights seemed to dim a little, casting long shadows across the floor. And in the corner, the piano sat, still and silent under its single spotlight. It was a king without a kingdom, a story waiting to be told. And as she walked past it one last time, her hand brushed against the cool, smooth wood of its side. For just a second, she let herself feel the pull, the deep, familiar longing. Then, she straightened her shoulders, picked up her tray, and moved back into the invisible world of her work, the music inside her quiet once more. The old man with the white hair finished his final piece with a stiff, precise nod. His fingers, though gnarled with age, moved like clockwork, hitting every note with an accuracy that was impressive but somehow cold. It was music for a room like this, pleasant and unobtrusive, a sound that filled the silences without ever really trying to break them. A small, polite ripple of applause followed. The kind of applause people give when they feel they are supposed to, not because they were truly moved. The old man gave a slight bow, closed the lid over the keys with a soft thud, and slowly packed up his sheet music, his task for the evening complete. For a moment, the lounge felt strangely quiet without the live music. The sounds of conversation seemed to rush in to fill the empty space, the clinking of ice in glasses, the low, confident laughter, the rustle of expensive fabric. Then, the hotel's sound system kicked in, a gentle stream of music flowing from hidden speakers. It was the kind of music you hear in elevators or while on hold, a smooth, soulless jazz that was designed to be ignored. It was oral wallpaper, and the young woman, still carrying her tray, barely registered it. It was just another part of the background. Like the soft lighting or the polished floors, she moved toward a table that had just emptied. Her mind already on the task ahead. Wipe the table, reset the silverware, make it look pristine and untouched for the next guests. It was a routine she could do in her sleep, a series of practiced, efficient movements. But as she reached for the clean cloth in her apron, a new song began to play from the speakers. It wasn't the smooth jazz anymore. The first few notes were different, complex, and layered. They were played on a piano, but it wasn't the simple, happy-go-lucky tune she expected. This was something else entirely. The melody was haunting, a thread of sadness woven through with something that felt like hope. It was a piece of classical music, but it wasn't the loud, bombastic kind she sometimes heard in movies. This was intimate and deeply personal. The notes seemed to hang in the air, each one carrying a weight and a story. She stopped dead, her hand frozen halfway to her apron. The tray felt suddenly very heavy in her other hand, but she barely noticed. The world around her began to blur. The faces of the guests, the glitter of the chandeliers, the dark wood of the tables, it all melted away into a soft, unfocused haze. The music wrapped around her like a warm, familiar blanket. She knew this song. She knew every rise and fall of the melody, every pause, every crescendo. It was a sonata, a word her father had taught her a long time ago. He had a whole stack of dusty records, and this particular sonata, had been his favorite. He would play it on their old record player, the needle crackling with a soft hiss before the music began. He called it The Story of a Heart. In her mind, she was no longer in the opulent hotel lounge. She was a little girl again, sitting on the worn, floral-patterned couch in their small living room. The air smelled of old books, her mother's cooking, and the faint, woody scent of the upright piano that stood against the far wall. It wasn't a grand, gleaming piano like the one in the corner of the lounge. It was scarred and chipped, one of the keys was a little yellowed, and it had a stubborn squeak when you pressed the sustain pedal. But to her, it was the most beautiful object in the world. Her father would come home from his long day at the factory, his face tired and smudged with a bit of grease. He would drop his lunchbox by the door, wash his hands, and without a word walk over to the piano. The moment his fingers touched the keys, his whole body would change. The tiredness would fall away, and his face would light up with a kind of quiet joy. He wasn't a famous concert pianist. He had never played in a grand hall, but in that small living room with his daughter as his only audience, he was a maestro. He would play this sonata, and he would tell her its story as he played. "Listen here," he would say, his fingers dancing over a light, airy section of the melody. "This is the part where you meet someone new, and your heart feels like it's flying." Then the music would shift, becoming more somber, more thoughtful. "And this," he would say, his voice softening, "this is the part where you have to say goodbye. It hurts, but it's a beautiful kind of hurt, because it means you really love something." She would sit beside him on the worn piano bench, her small legs dangling above the floor. She would watch his hands, mesmerized by the way they moved, so strong and yet so gentle. He would let her place her tiny fingers on top of his as he played, so she could feel the vibration of the music, the life pulsing through the wood and strings. "Feel it," he would whisper. "Don't just hear it. Feel it in your bones." And she did. She felt every note, every emotion that he poured into the music. It was their language, the way they talked about things that were too big or too complicated for words. The memory was so real, so vivid, that she could almost smell the faint scent of her father's tobacco on his sweater. She could almost feel the smooth, cool ivory of the piano keys under her own small fingers. The ache in her feet was gone, replaced by the memory of swinging her legs and kicking the front of the piano gently, just to hear the dull thud. The weight of the tray in her hand was gone, replaced by the feeling of her father's arm around her shoulder, pulling her close as the music swelled to its emotional peak. In the hotel lounge, she stood perfectly still, a statue in a black dress. A guest tried to get her attention to order a drink, but she didn't see him. To him, she was just a lost-looking waitress staring into space. He sighed and waved down another employee, but she wasn't lost. She was more present than she had been in years, lost in a memory that was more real to her than the life she was currently living. The music was a time machine, transporting her back to a time when her world was small, but full of love. A time when music wasn't just background noise. It was the very air she breathed. The final, lingering notes of the sonata faded from the hotel speakers. A profound silence seemed to fall over her mind. The memory held on for a second longer, the image of her father smiling at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Then, like a bubble bursting, the world came rushing back in. The sharp clink of a spoon against a ceramic cup, a woman's high-pitched laugh, the low, thrumming beat of the next song on the playlist, a generic pop song that felt jarringly out of place. She blinked, her eyes focusing once more on the room in front of her. The table she was supposed to be clearing was still there. The tray was still heavy in her hand. The little girl on the piano bench was gone, and she was just a waitress again, standing in the middle of a fancy lounge. A wave of something washed over her, a mix of deep sadness for what she had lost, and a sharp, piercing longing. The music had unlocked a door inside her that she had kept bolted shut for a long time. And now that it was open, she didn't know how to close it again. She felt a tremor run through her, a sudden, urgent need to feel those keys under her fingers, not as a memory, but for real. The silence that followed the music was a heavy blanket. The world came back to her in a rush of sharp, unrelated sounds and sights. The clatter of a spoon on a plate, a woman's high, tinkling laugh, the low murmur of a dozen conversations all happening at once. But none of it really registered. It was just noise. The only thing that was real was the echo of the sonata still vibrating in her bones and the sight of the empty piano in the corner. Bathed in its soft, lonely light, it felt like a magnet was pulling her. A deep, powerful force that seemed to originate in her chest and pull her forward, 1 inch at a time. Her feet, which had been aching just moments before, now felt strangely light, as if they wanted to move on their own. The tray in her hand, a familiar, heavy weight, suddenly felt like an anchor holding her back. It was the symbol of her job, her role, her invisibility. The piano was the opposite. It was a symbol of everything she had been, everything she had locked away, a loud, commanding voice in her head. The voice of common sense and survival started shouting, "What are you doing? Stop it. Go back to work." It was a sharp, cold voice, the voice that got her out of bed every morning and reminded her to pay the bills. It painted a vivid, terrifying picture. She saw the Mater D, his usually calm face twisted with anger. She heard his voice, sharp in public, telling her she was fired. She imagined the shame of having to pack up her small locker and walk out of the hotel, past the very people who had just watched her be humiliated. She saw the smirks on their faces, the whispers. "Did you see that waitress? Who did she think she was?" Her heart began to pound against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. Her palms felt damp, and the silver tray started to slip in her sweaty grip. This was insane. It was a terrible, career-ending idea. She was a waitress. They paid her to be quiet and efficient, to fill glasses and clear plates. They didn't pay her to have feelings or memories or to touch things that didn't belong to her. The piano was for performers, for artists, for people who lived in a world of light and applause. She lived in the world of shadows and dirty dishes. She took a step back, away from the pull. The voice of fear was winning. It was always the one that won. It was practical and strong, and it had kept her safe for a long time. She turned her body away from the piano, forcing herself to look at the tables that needed her. A man was trying to catch her eye, a slightly impatient look on his face. This was her reality. This was her job. She needed to focus, but as she took a step toward his table, the memory of her father's voice whispered in her ear, "Feel it in your bones." It wasn't a command, just a gentle reminder. And she realized with a sudden, painful clarity that she hadn't really felt anything in a long, long time. She had been numb, going through the motions, a ghost in her own life. The ache in her feet, the tiredness in her eyes, the knot of worry in her stomach that wasn't feeling, that was just enduring. The music, even for just a few minutes, had made her feel alive again. It had been a shock to the system, like cold water on a sleeping person. She stopped again, caught between two worlds. The world of the safe, predictable routine and the world of the dangerous, unknown possibility. She looked at the impatient man, then back at the piano. She thought about her father, not just the memory of him playing, but the man himself. He had worked a hard, thankless job at a factory, just like she worked a hard, thankless job at a hotel. But he had the music. It was his other world, the place where he was truly himself. He had given that world to her, and she had packed it away in a box under her bed, afraid to open it. What was she so afraid of? Losing this job? A job that made her feel invisible and small? Being laughed at by people who didn't even see her as a human being anyway? The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but something else was rising up to meet it. It was a small, quiet spark of defiance. It was the feeling she got when she was a little girl and her father told her she was strong enough to play a difficult chord. It was a flicker of the person she used to be, the person who believed she could do anything if she just practiced enough, before the voice of fear could shout her down again. She acted. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like an impulse she chose not to stop. She walked over to an empty service station near the wall and, with a quiet sense of finality, placed her heavy silver tray on the surface. The small clink of the glasses was the only sound she made. It was the sound of her letting go of her anchor. She turned and faced the piano. There was no going back now. Every step toward it felt like walking through mud. Her legs felt heavy, her whole body was screaming at her to stop. The room seemed to get quieter, or maybe it was just the blood rushing in her ears. She could feel eyes on her now. Not the usual invisible glances, but real, curious stares. A few guests paused their conversations, their expressions shifting from boredom to confusion. The maitre, standing by his podium, frowned, his body tensing as he prepared to intervene. She didn't look at any of them. She kept her eyes fixed on the piano, on the single spotlight that made it look like it was floating on its own island of light. It was the only thing that mattered. The few steps to the platform felt like the longest walk of her life. She could hear a soft whisper from a nearby table. "Is she lost?" Another voice, a little louder, laced with amusement. "I think she's going to sit down?" A ripple of soft, dismissive laughter spread through the nearby tables. It was exactly what she had feared. The sound was like tiny needles pricking at her skin. Her face felt hot with embarrassment, and for a terrifying second she thought her legs would just give out. But she kept walking. She reached the platform, took the small step up, and stood before the piano. It was even more beautiful up close. The black lacquer was so polished she could see her own distorted reflection in it. The ivory keys looked pale and inviting. She reached out a trembling hand and lifted the fallboard, the long wooden cover that protected the keys. It moved with a soft, satisfying click. Then she sat down on the polished leather bench. It was cool against her skin. The laughter in the room had died down, replaced by a tense, confused silence. They were waiting for the joke, for the disaster, for the crazy waitress to be dragged away. She could feel their collective gaze on her back, a heavy, physical weight. She took a deep breath, the air catching in her throat. Her fingers hovered over the keys, shaking slightly. This was it. The point of no return. And in that moment the fear was still there, but underneath it something stronger was beginning to stir. It was the music, waiting to be let out. Her fingers, which had been trembling just moments before, felt a strange sense of calm as they settled onto the cool ivory keys. It was like meeting an old friend after a lifetime apart. There was no awkwardness, only a deep, familiar rightness. The room was silent, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a tense, heavy silence filled with judgment and expectation. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her back like a physical weight, and she could hear the faint, almost imperceptible sound of the maitre-d's shoes as he took a step forward. Ready to put an end to this madness, she took one last, shaky breath and closed her eyes. She didn't see the gilded room or the confused faces anymore. She only saw darkness, a blank canvas waiting for a story. And then she began to play. The first notes were not gentle. They were not a simple, hesitant tune. They were a thunderous, cascading explosion of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. It was a roar, a declaration, a storm unleashed from the quietest person in the room. The sound was so big, so full of raw power, that it physically jolted the audience. A woman near the front jumped in her seat, her hand flying to her chest. The smirks and the dismissive laughter vanished in an instant, wiped clean by the sheer force of the music. The maitre-d', who had been halfway to the piano, froze mid-stride. His hand, which had been raised to gesture for security, dropped slowly to his side. He stood there, a statue in a perfectly tailored suit, his mouth slightly agape. This was not the clumsy, out-of-tune fumbling he had been expecting. This was something else entirely. The young woman's body, which had been stiff with fear, began to move with the music. She wasn't just sitting on the bench. She was a part of the piano. Her shoulders swayed with the rhythm, her head tilted back as if in prayer, and her fingers flew across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. They were no longer just fingers. They were 10 independent dancers, each telling a different part of the same passionate story. The music was a complex, emotional battle. There were moments of frantic, desperate energy where the notes came so fast they were almost a blur, a torrent of sound that spoke of panic and heartbreak. Then, just as suddenly it would shift, a delicate, haunting melody would emerge from the storm, a single, clear voice singing a song of profound sadness. It was the kind of music that reached into your chest and squeezed the air from your lungs. It was the sound of loneliness, of loss, of memories that hurt to remember but were too precious to forget. In the lounge, conversations died completely. One by one, people turned their chairs away from their tables and toward the piano. A man who had been scrolling through his phone slowly lowered it to the table, his screen forgotten. A group of women who had been gossiping fell silent, their expressions softening as they listened. The room, which had been a collection of separate, private worlds, was now a single, unified audience. They were no longer just wealthy patrons at a hotel. They were human beings, collectively experiencing something beautiful and painful and real. The music continued its journey. It was a conversation between light and dark, between hope and despair. There were passages that were so tender and gentle, they felt like a lullaby, a promise that everything would be okay. Then a wave of sound would crash over the room again, reminding them that peace was often fleeting. It was the story of a life with all its messy, complicated, and beautiful contradictions. And the young woman was telling that story with her entire being. It wasn't just a performance. It was a confession. She was pouring all the years of her invisible service, all the unspoken grief for her father, all the dreams she had packed away into the music. The piano was her voice, and for the first time in a long time, she had something to say. The people in the room were captivated. They saw the simple, black dress, the tired posture, and they heard the music of a genius. The contrast was staggering. It was like finding a priceless masterpiece hidden in a dusty attic. They were masters of the universe, people who controlled fortunes and commanded respect, but in that moment they were utterly humbled. They were in the presence of a power that had nothing to do with money or status. It was the power of raw, unfiltered talent and emotion. The social armor they all wore, the polite smiles and the practiced indifference, had been stripped away, leaving only their shared, vulnerable humanity. The piece built toward its final, breathtaking climax. The tempo quickened, the volume swelled, and the melody and harmony clashed in a glorious, heartbreaking battle. Her whole body was moving now, her back arching, her hands flying, her face a mask of intense concentration and emotion. It was as if she was channeling something far greater than herself, a force that was using her as its vessel. The room was completely still, the air thick with anticipation. The final, resonant chord was not just played. It was struck with such force that it seemed to hang in the air, a shimmering, vibrating entity that refused to die. And then silence, but it wasn't the same tense silence as before. This was a different kind of quiet. It was a sacred, profound silence that felt as full and as heavy as the music that had just filled it. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, staring at the young woman at the piano, their minds trying to process what they had just witnessed. The air seemed to crackle with a shared, unspoken emotion. It was the sound of 100 hearts, all broken and healed in the exact same moment, all at once. The silence stretched, a living, breathing thing in the grand room. It was so profound that it felt louder than the music that had just filled it. The young woman sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, her eyes closed. For a few precious seconds, she was still lost in the world she had created. A world of sound and feeling where she was not a waitress, but a storyteller. But the world outside was waiting, and it was a world that had been utterly transformed. Then, a movement. Near the back of the room, an elderly man, his face lined with the wisdom of many years, slowly pushed his chair back. The soft scrape of its legs against the polished floor was the only sound. He rose to his full height, his eyes fixed on the young woman at the piano. He didn't say a word. He just brought his wrinkled hands together and began to clap. It was a solitary, steady sound, clap, clap, clap. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. It was a statement. His single act broke the spell. A woman at a nearby table, tears glistening on her cheeks, stood up and joined him. Then another person, and another. The sound grew from a steady, respectful rhythm into a wave of pure, unadulterated emotion. Within moments, the entire room was on its feet. The applause was not the polite, obligatory clapping they gave the scheduled performer. It was a roaring, thunderous ovation, a physical force that seemed to press in on her from all sides. It was the sound of 100 hearts, all beating as one, all expressing a gratitude and an awe that words could not capture. The sound finally broke through to her. Her eyes flew open and the world rushed back in. She saw the sea of faces, all turned toward her, all smiling, some with tears streaming down their faces. She saw the Mater D, his face a mask of utter shock and wonder, his rigid posture completely gone. The wave of sound hit her like a physical blow, and a hot blush of embarrassment and panic began to creep up her neck. What had she done? The sheer, overwhelming reality of her situation crashed down on her. She was a waitress. She had just made a spectacle of herself. She was going to be fired. She started to shrink, to pull her hands away from the keys as if they were burning hot. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and become the invisible ghost she had been just minutes before. But as she made a move to stand, the applause grew even louder, more desperate, as if they were afraid she might vanish. They weren't clapping for a performer who had finished a set. They were clapping for a miracle they had just witnessed. The Mater D began to walk toward the piano. Her heart sank. This was it. The humiliation. The public scolding. She braced herself, her eyes fixed on the polished floor, waiting for the angry words. But he didn't look angry. He looked humbled. He reached the piano and stood beside her for a moment, letting the applause wash over them both. Then he leaned down and spoke to her, his voice so soft she could barely hear it over the roar. "That," he said, his voice filled with a genuine respect she had never heard from him before, "was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard in this room." Before she could even process his words, a man in a slightly rumpled suit pushed his way through the crowd. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wide with excitement. He ignored the Mater D and focused entirely on her. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice urgent. "I've been in this business for 30 years, and I have never heard anything like that." He fumbled in his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, crisp business card, holding it out to her as if it were a treasure. "My name is not important," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "What's important is you. You have a gift. A real, once-in-a-generation gift. Please, call me. We need to talk." She stared at the card, then at the man's earnest, pleading face. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. This couldn't be happening. This kind of thing didn't happen to people like her. It happened in movies, to other people. Her first instinct was to refuse, to mumble an apology and run back to the safety of the kitchen. The old voice of fear was screaming at her to say no, to protect herself from the disappointment that was surely to follow, but then she looked out at the crowd. They were still standing, still clapping. She saw the young couple, holding hands and smiling at her with tears in their eyes. She saw the group of businessmen, their usual air of superiority completely gone, replaced by a look of pure admiration. She saw the old man who had started it all, giving her a small, encouraging nod. They saw her. They really saw her. Not as a waitress, not as a function, but as an artist. As a human being who had shared a piece of her soul with them. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took the card. The paper felt thin and fragile in her trembling fingers, but it also felt like the heaviest, most important thing she had ever held. The man let out a breath he didn't know he was holding and gave her a grateful, almost reverent smile. With the Mater D's help, she stood up from the piano bench on shaky legs. The applause swelled again as she turned to face the room. She didn't know what to do, so she just gave a small, awkward bow. The response was another roar of approval. She began to walk away from the piano, back toward the service station where she had left her tray. The path she had walked just minutes before, a walk of quiet dread, was now a walk of honor. People reached out to touch her arm as she passed, not in a grabby, intrusive way, but with a gentle, respectful tap. They whispered words she couldn't hear but could feel. "Thank you. Bravo. beautiful. She reached the service station and picked up her silver tray. It felt familiar and heavy in her hand, a symbol of the life she knew. But in her other hand she clutched the small, crisp business card, a symbol of a life she had never dared to imagine. She stood there for a moment, a young woman in a simple black dress, holding the weight of her past and the promise of her future. The music was no longer just a memory locked away in a box under her bed. It was out now, alive in the hearts of everyone who had heard it. And it was, finally, a key that had just unlocked the door to the rest of her life.